Tonight I'm going to talk to you all about smart city tech and why you should be very afraid of it. And I've also done the liberty of trying to splice in Chicago examples where I didn't already have them in my research. If they're imperfect examples, I want to hear that in the Q&A. And I hope as I run through these slides as quickly as I can, that you are thinking about how to apply them to Chicago specifically. You'll see what I mean as we go. What I'm going to do in this presentation, I just spent the last year at Harvard Kennedy School's Technology and Public Purpose Fellowship. It's a fellowship designed to study emerging technologies and whether or not those technologies are serving public purpose or not, like very broadly. And my cohort of fellows, we studied all different types of technologies in positive or negative ways. And I went into the fellowship pre-pandemic, like I wrote up my pitch, just being affected by the Sidewalk Labs backlash. Like I was like, oh, that's interesting. People don't seem to want that. There was a big push to have this technology. That's what I want to study. But then when I entered the fellowship, everyone was in lockdown, surveillance was in the news, police tech was more in the news than ever. And also, I'm sure many listeners followed the story in San Diego where smart streetlights were filming Black Lives Matter protesters. So the report ended up just expanding on that example. So San Diego, what happens when our streetlights are really filming protesters? So some of the conclusions I came up with that I'll go into sort of detail about is just smart city technology is often surveillance technology, and also just sort of thinking about police technology a little bit more broadly than it's talked about. Even some of the organizations that I cite and enjoy that really follow like police surveillance don't, like there's some edge of police technology when really police are using all sorts of technology as ways to receive information about people without a warrant, personal or urban tech like streetlights. So this, you don't have to read the 80-page report. That's the point of this presentation. So I kick off in the report just trying to really outline what's dangerous about smart city technology and to scope it. And the way I ended up, or where I landed, was if the smart city technology can potentially identify you, that's the dangerous stuff. So like weather meters, all these other things that are called smart city, they're interesting, but they weren't sort of on my radar as like a risk. But a lot of other technologies that either are directly identifying you or were. And also to simplify it in terms of regulation, I started thinking about these silos of technology, data, and uses, because if you're thinking about sort of the policy landscape, Illinois has the biometric data law, so it's like a straight up like data regulation. There's a lot of other privacy data regulations at play, some around consumer data, some more broad. And then we're also seeing technology regulation, so facial recognition technology regulation or surveillance technology regulation, but they're sort of called technologies, even though they mean the software and the hardware. And then finally, we are seeing some like use policies. So in Massachusetts, there was a law last year where they said transit data could only be used for transit planning and not also for police. But sort of thinking about these things like as simply as possible, but also do we have to regulate all three silos, or I don't know if they're silos, categories, and what's missing if we're only regulating one? So what is like Illinois not picking up on if it only has biometric data? Also like thinking about location data specifically separately from biometric data as like an identifying data type. I'll get into that with some further examples. Okay, so now I have like 5 big categories of harm that I sussed out while I was looking at all of these examples. Wait, that's Chicago. And the first was totalitarianism. So the examples here where it showed up was like Sidewalk Labs. People didn't even want it, but the technology was coming in. It seems like a bad thing to do things without the will of the people if people didn't ask for it. Another harm that sort of goes along the totalitarian line is just sort of this hyper technocratic-ism replacing democracy. So rather than like asking people, like, what do you want in your neighborhood? The idea that like, we'll just track people and then we'll know what they want and then we'll decide what they want is like a very different way to govern. And then the last is sort of like a catch-all, but I think is interesting. It's that when you are using these identifying data collections, you're standardizing certain narratives and certain stories. And you can empower a mono ideology that way, a police state, chill these things of dissent, such as protest. So those are like the 3 like bullets of the first one. So as mentioned, I try to come up with Chicago examples. In the report, I have a lot of examples of tracking protesters with sort of traditional police tech or airplanes at quasi like police tech, or like the San Diego smart street light example, but Chicago was absolutely included in the Homeland Security flights over cities. So was Aurora. So we're like most big cities. But that is an example where Chicago sort of fits in to this totalitarian state, watching protesters from the sky. Next one is Panopticonism. So this is a fancier word for privacy risks, maybe. But of course, it means more than that. And sort of the breakdown of bullets here that I sussed out was being tracked all the time decreases your privacy, but also your autonomy and freedom to move about and do democratic action. Its own category is these unwarranted searches and seizures. So there's a lot of Fourth Amendment cases in the courts right now. There was one in LA related to scooter data. So that's very smart city-esque. There was one in Baltimore related to a spy plane that originally got thrown out of court because they're like, planes are okay, police always use planes. But then when they did some more, when they received more research about what those new data enabled planes could actually collect, they're like, oh wait, this is different. This is a Fourth Amendment violation. And maybe we can get into like Fourth Amendment doctrine more specifically if people have questions in the Q&A. But this like traditional constitutional protection that the state can now just search all your stuff is eroding with a variety of technologies. And some of those would be called quote unquote smart city technologies. And then lastly, and a big one is like the more data that the state collects, the more likely that data can be breached. So any sort of like nefarious actor can commit identity theft or like foreign adversaries. Like the more the government collects, the more it puts everyone at risk. And so the example I had here, even though Illinois has the biometric law, I know Clearview AI has some pending lawsuits related to BIPA, but just an example, maybe two, of how these things might be regulated, of Chicago using Clearview AI the way many cities are using, would be an example of intense surveillance if people can match your face against databases with traditional CCTV footage. So next category, so this is 3 out of 5, is discrimination. If you get the broken windows reference, that's cool. These are all Magritte paintings. I thought, I don't know, I wanted to use Magritte paintings because he sort of pushed against authoritative norms or something, but I also just think they're pretty painting, so that's why they're there. But the big categories here are it reinforces historical discrimination, and also reinforces so like historical discrimination in urban planning or housing or any of those sort of fields. And then also reinforces the visibility and like less visibility of certain people. And you can see this in like not just the way the technologies are used, but where they're deployed and how they're deployed. So it's just like every layer is sort of like a little discriminatory. And that is not good for democracy. Again, like tying everything back to democracy, it's probably not good generally as well, like morally. It provides, the last one is sort of discrimination and the flip side. So providing digital services to certain folks and not other people. So a big thing in New York City is the Link NYC kiosks. I'm calling in from New York. They were supposed to be deployed everywhere, and they are not deployed in poor neighborhoods. So ShotSpotter, this is my first mention of ShotSpotter. It won't be my last, but this was in my report earlier. If you're following the ShotSpotter news and advocacy and backlash in Chicago, this was sort of the moment that really ignited it, at least in Chicago, but probably the rest of the country. There's been so many more news reports since this came out. Also, shout out to Jamie Calvin and Invisible Institute, which I'm sure many of you are like friends with. But he was like one of the first people, yes, to write this for the Intercept. But that's sort of an example of this harm happened, and the police wouldn't have been deployed without this technology there. And this technology is always like across many cities, including Chicago, more often deployed in Black and brown neighborhoods. And if the consequence of sort of like deploying, like if Adam would be alive without ShotSpotter, that's a real harm that you can discuss. So 4 out of 5 privatizations. This is a big one with Sidewalk Labs and some other things going on in Miami and Nevada. But sort of like breaking out, like why is privatization of our sidewalks and our surveillance bad? It replaces democratic decision-making with corporate decision-making. This is bad because then you're taking away sort of democratic mechanisms like will of the people to like a few hired actors that might not have the best interests of everyone at play, and also everyone should be a democratic agent. Related to that is if you privatize things, you no longer have constitutional protections or accountability laws. So you can't FOIA Sidewalk Labs for like their data unless there's some agreement set up. I'm sure many Shy Hack Night folks have encountered that if you've done public records requests on certain private vendors. And to the point about Fourth Amendment protections, if you get into the Fourth Amendment doctrine, there's something called the third party doctrine. So if there's a very like high level review of third party doctrine, is there's a concept that if you're giving your information to a business, you never sort of assumed full privacy there. So it also like reduces our constitutional protections to privatize things. And then lastly, it expands surveillance monopolies. So this is Cory Doctorow and other folks have written about this as sort of I don't know if it's against or like a follow-up to surveillance capitalism. And some scholars have also written about police technology monopolies. But if you get in a situation where one business has like all of this type of data for all cities, and also you can't FOIA that and you can't control that, then all of a sudden this one corporation has an outsized impact on like how that sector works. So if there's like one streetlight company that has all the camera data or something, maybe that's not the best, maybe the police tech is a better example, but we lose a lot of autonomy and control, especially if that data is centralized with one corporation. And So, tell me in the Q&A if this is a good example. I found this just before the presentation, but there's this parking meter situation in Chicago where they were also having investors like bet on the meters. Maybe somebody can explain it to me better in the Q&A. But parking meters across like many cities, like in Boston, when I was doing my research, there's a whole privatization effort, and like paying those fines becomes more difficult, and like you get caught up in a whole thing. And there's like complaints across the country about privatizing parking fines. So I would love to hear more about what's going on with Chicago. So final example and sort of like the harm framework is solutionism. So tech solutionism, that whole concept. So like breaking down like why is thinking technology can solve everything a problem? Like very broadly, one is sometimes you get yourself in a situation where you have so much confidence that if we just sort of like collect more data on this or like optimize, that it'll be like solved, that you're agreeing to things that there's no evidence that it's like actually solved that problem before. There's a lot of transportation intelligence systems. They're collecting all this car data, promising to like reduce congestion in like Los Angeles and New York City and these places that have a lot of things creating that type of congestion that can't be solved with just more data collection. Like there will have to be different infrastructure, different fine schemes, different amounts of cars on the road. Like there are all these things that you would need in addition to the most optimized data that you could think of. But folks are very like convinced if we harness the power of data, that will be enough to solve it. Or like even maybe more egregious, like homelessness data cases where folks are like, let's just spend money on like studying homelessness rather than just sort of setting up housing. So that's the second example there. It's like instead of providing material needs, you're also using this limited tax money on data collection. So like creating this data-driven government takes away from actually giving people the direct material things they need, like housing or something. And then the last one is just, it creates need for more technology. So a lot of cities now are trying to invest in 5G because all their smart cityware needs 5G, but they're just going to need whatever the next thing is as well. And again, like maybe these things aren't proven. Chicago example, I couldn't find one in the nick of time before the presentation, so I was like, ShotSpotter again. I'm just going to use ShotSpotter. But I'm curious if folks have Chicago specific examples. So I mentioned this is all coming from this report I wrote. In the report, there are a ton of global examples. So like a lot of US examples and international examples underneath each one of these categories. I have like a ton of footnotes. Some of the international ones are particularly egregious, but like they're not hypothetical. Like they're real and they're happening now. And we should pay attention to that to make sure that that doesn't happen in our cities or in also the global cities. So this is, if folks saw this on Twitter recently, like the artwork's computer screen not working. This is my personalization for Chicago. But 10 calls to action. The report has 10 calls to action, and I'll lightly go over them, but I wonder if folks have really specific examples of how to deploy this in Chicago. So there are 10 calls to action because 10's a nice round number, and they're in 3 sort of broad categories. So 3 sides. We'll go into the 3 categories. So like the priority, we have to stop harmful smart city technology data uses. So like that framework in the beginning. But we have to like stop it now. We have to preempt it. Like it can't happen anymore. If you're collecting weather data, that's fine. But we have to strictly limit law enforcement access to identifying data, especially if our previous protections like 4th Amendment and such are like not doing what they used to do. So really focusing maybe across sort of like the regulatory scheme of doing that. So like I'm a big sort of use all the tools in the toolkit that you have available. So like I would suggest like regulating like across those types like technology, data, and uses, but really looking closely at how police are accessing data now and like what that leads to. That San Diego example of using the streetlight camera footage on protesters, if you looked at their website, they had like very clear documentation, like these are the smart streetlights we own, and yes, they've gone over budget, but this is exactly what they collect, and this is how we share with police. Here's like the PDF, like it was all up. So it wasn't like a lack of like quote unquote transparency, but like maybe that wasn't legible to folks. Maybe the consequence of that was not sort of stressed enough, but it wasn't even like a secretive, we don't share, which there is plenty of secretive, we don't sort of disclose where we're getting this data, but really thinking about if we want to have democracy, we can't have state police looking at everything we do every time we walk outside, is my thesis. So step 2 to that would be stop high-tech profiling. This relates to the first one, of course, but has like really specific, not just sort of collecting identifying data, but like these enabled things to be able to track certain individuals of different types. So like the more egregious international examples that we're seeing with the Uyghur population in China and now Afghanistan, like biometrics collection, but it's very, the more we collect identifying data, but also gender or race or anything that a group might want to like start tracking those folks by is dangerous. Of course, there are trade-offs with demographic data. Sometimes you can also show that there's discrimination, but I think, again, thinking about like how don't default to like collecting everything and letting security officials have it, because if you have a situation like Afghanistan, which isn't in the report, but there's like a new example every month, then you'll have somebody that you didn't intend to have that information then have it, and they might use it for a different purpose. So thinking like anticipating secondary uses that could be harmful. I feel like I'm going over time, so I'll keep these ones really short. So minimize the collection of use of identifying data everywhere. So that this is challenging, but this is the same way of sort of thinking that maybe a streetlight is also like dangerous police technology, or maybe what you say on social media is like tracked for punitive purposes or foreign adversaries or anything that you can imagine. We need to think about like how we use identifying data, full stop. So maybe we don't scan our face to fill out every application, like unemployment apps or something, because we know that that can be leaked and used for something else. Maybe we figure out a different scheme that is like more mutable or thoughtful. Fourth, provide meaningful redress for those harmed. Right now, if you're misidentified with facial recognition technology, there's some lawsuits, but there's not like a clear cut sort of like crime that, well, I guess there is like false imprisonment and that sort of thing. And some of the surveillance technology laws have rights to action if your data is collected, but that's only in a few municipalities right now. And then for just sort of data breaches, full stop, like there's not a meaningful standard for compensation. Like they'll give you identity theft software for 2 years, and it's just sort of not meeting the harm that happens. And that will be important to set up, because we should anticipate that more harms will happen, and that justice should be served with meaningful redress. So very quickly, next section, not only do we have to like stop doing the bad stuff of like identifying data that could harm people, then we just sort of have to expand our collective capacity to evaluate how technology impacts democracy specifically. So there's some orgs that focus on democracy, like Center for Technology and Democracy, and ACLU sort of does, and a lot of orgs like mention it, but just sort of thinking about longer term consequences, like it's not just sort of privacy or antitrust competition, but if we're sort of eroding our ability to convene, to protest, to make a statement, then it's like a much larger harm. But also just thinking about global politics, if we want democracy to thrive, we have to think about how technology is either serving that or not serving that. So these 3 calls to action are related to that, and it's about making sure that like we number one, we know what our cities are using, or number 6 or 5, I can't see with the 5, 6, like reconsidering technology's role in wicked problems. So if housing is always an issue, is technology, how much can technology solve the housing problems that we have? 7, challenge data narratives. So a lot of this is, as mentioned, if the state's the only one collecting information, like maybe that's not the full story. So considering what is missing from data sets, as well as like what is being collected, and making sure that we have a variety of narratives so that we can make informed democratic decisions about things instead of just having like a one view state. And then I think this is my second to last slide. So, okay, after we stop doing like the harmful things and we start being able to analyze things better, like everyone, governments, nonprofits, private sector folks, then the last thing would be to fortify old and build new democratic spaces. Again, if what we want is democracy, traditionally, some of these things that helped it were public streets as like forums. How do we protect those? Hopefully with those regs we do, but then also how do we think about how technology can serve more democratic decision-making? So building up spaces for community decision-making is crucial. Thinking about how technology can serve those democratic spaces, looking to countries like Taiwan, or even like very small examples of collaborative work where technology facilitates dialogue and consensus rather than just, again, this like tracking and sort of, we know what you want. And then lastly, imagine new democratic rights in the wake of new technologies. I don't know if that's too much of a like redo the Constitution, but if the Fourth Amendment isn't working for that, maybe we need new types of ideas and rights. And that is the most broad, but that's also why it's the last one. But just sort of now that we know we have these effects and constraints, can we conceive of new rights that everybody should have? So last slide, and then I'll be happy to do Q&A. I hope folks have a lot of comments. Am I the first person who's ever said that? Like, I hope folks have Chicago examples to share in addition to any sort of questions you have for me specifically. So resources for my work. So that whole report, you can probably Google it and find it, but it's also on the Substack. So the third bullet, I had an ongoing newsletter of various surveillance news, and then I put the report out as the last newsletter item. I also did a bunch of public records requests. The Chicago results were just look at our contract database online. So there's nothing like really juicy for Chicago, but I did 29 other cities. So you can look at what other cities gave back to me, and also my public records request template if you want to copy it for anything on Muckrock. And then on GitHub, I did a couple spreadsheets related to smart city vendors. So you might want to search the Chicago database against those vendors that I found in a bunch of cities. And I did some like keywords too, just based on like all of my research to sort of, I don't know how helpful those things are, but I use them and maybe they're helpful for what I hope will be your investigations into Chicago smart city work. And then Chicago, I mentioned that you haven't like been searching Chicago's contracts. there's a website for that. You can look at the ShotSpotter contract, which is old. I don't know if they talk about the renewal there, which is interesting. Maybe that's something to FOIA more on. And then I mentioned Invisible Institute, but also Lucy Parsons Labs does a lot of police surveillance technology in Chicago. And the former is absolutely like peppered throughout my report along with other city organizations. But then the final slot is just sort of a blank, like what else in Chicago are resources that you all know of and that you would fill in to sort of execute the call for 10, especially like as you get into the more abstract. I think that like really requires being in community with folks and coming up with what those solutions are. Like when I did my research, I wasn't like, the solution is ban facial recognition technology. I got it, I nailed it. I see like that not filling all the gaps. Like, I think there are a lot of gaps and like a lot of tools that are needed and a lot of perspectives. So that concludes my PowerPoint presentation.
All right, thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, so we have about 15 minutes for questions. We have some that are queued up already. But just as a reminder to folks, if you do have questions, please ask them in the live chat and we'll try to get to them. We'll definitely prioritize questions from you all first. Eric, do you want to take the first question?
Yeah, so we've got an audience question that says, when it comes to things from the Panopticonism menu, are prosecutors bringing this data to court as part of their cases, or is this kept out to avoid Fourth Amendment issues?
I think if I understand the question, it's like, how is this data being used to prosecute people? And I think the example would be like the scooter data is just sort of speculative. But many examples with like cell phones or license plate readers or like spy planes, essentially like police will use data. They don't have to like go through the work of getting a warrant because it's accepted out of sort of warrant land currently for like a variety of reasons. Like there's like a Fourth Amendment doctrine is about a reasonable expectation of privacy. So generally walking around the street, that's public. And so you're not supposed to have a reasonable expectation of privacy. That's why CCTV doesn't require a warrant and that sort of thing. But recent Fourth Amendment law has been sort of pushing the envelope a little bit more. So like the big maybe watershed moment, not as watershed as people want, was a case Carpenter versus the United States. And that was about cell phone data. And they use cell phone data to track somebody. And they found that it was just, it didn't match a reasonable expectation because it was so complete. Like it was like over weeks or something. They were tracking the suspect. That don't want to misquote Carpenter, but it was like all of a sudden, like traditionally Fourth Amendment laws, like if somebody goes into your house without a warrant, like very physical, like breaking walls and all these sorts of, or, you know, breaking sort of what you think of as like private versus public. But Carpenter, since they considered cell phone data, all of a sudden thought about like the digital layer. Like one is breaking sort of like privacy on the digital layer. So since Carpenter, and Jones was a previous related case, there's been a lot of litigation trying to expand Carpenter, but Carpenter, they were like, we're only doing it for this specific type of cell phone search and nothing else. Like, don't read this broadly. Like that was the final summary there. So folks are continuing to try to expand that, but it really comes to in prosecution, if police can just search everywhere you've been without a warrant, then all of a sudden policing like looks very differently. But you would need the follow-up to sort of, you know, evidence, conviction, court. And that would, all that follow-up is probably enough for the case without having to say how you like found the person. But sometimes these things are used too, like cell phone data.
Cool, I can take the next one. So this is actually my question. So companies that sell smart city technology seem pretty good at selling their products. If I'm in government procurement and I care about this issue, what kinds of questions should I ask to identify if smart city's product is dangerous as you define it?
Yeah, I originally went into the project thinking, this is like a slightly long-winded way of answering this. Like I was like, oh, maybe if procurement officers just had data rights contract language, like really specific, like data recommendations, like don't collect identifying data and make sure everything is open data with the city so that they have access, you don't have like these privatization issues, then like that will be like discrete and fixable and like work. There's like a lot of incentive reasons like for companies to not want that. And for maybe government officers to not, or contract officers prioritize sort of data rights, but also it doesn't sort of address like these other harms. And one of the things I talked to several cities when I was like doing this research, and one of the things that I heard was cities will contract with a smart city vendor, and the smart city vendor will buy data from data brokers. So like data brokers have been in the news a lot too. So like cell phone location data that's like very granular, and then they'll make their insights. And then the smart city vendor will sort of roll up those insights for the city. The city doesn't know where that came from. Like it's a subcontract, it's like an adjacent contract, it's something that the government doesn't have total access to. And much like the Clearview AI cases, like many police chiefs and manager roles have said they didn't know that like the officers were using Clearview AI. So I think I think there again like a multi-pronged approach. Like I think you have to look at your contract carefully, make sure that you're not sort of like selling out your community members. A lot of like there are like secondary markets in these smart city contracts where the vendor is trying to collect data to sell separately beyond like giving the service. So it's like be savvy about the contracts, consider subcontracts, consider things that aren't contract, but also like hopefully your legislative body can put in some sort of laws that provide redress if all of a sudden like these things that aren't regulated because you can't touch them or see them, like fog of war style, then if a constituent or community member is somehow has their privacy invaded, there's still like recourse. So even if you can't see it in the contract, there's going to be some sort of right for the person. Like they're going to do you're going to pass like 18 laws, I think, but and look at your contract.
I think a related question on that I had, especially on the side of how do we pass these laws, is I'm wondering if like part of your research, like were you able to identify successful strategies for persuading more complacent folks that these issues are more urgent, especially like folks that are less technically inclined?
Yeah, I mean, I'm encouraged, but well, they're like both ticking up. It feels like the surveillance is ticking up, but also sort of different regulatory approaches is ticking up. Like when I was running the newsletter, I was like, every week I'm gonna just do a news roundup of everything related to like this issue area as I see it. And like every other week there was like a new related law somewhere. And then we can get into sort of like, are the laws actually implementable and are they working? But I was very encouraged by the increase in like all of the above. I don't have like a favorite of the solutions, and I think some are harder to implement than others. But to see at least legislative bodies attempting to like think about this was encouraging to me. I think the biggest issue probably now that hasn't really been addressed is this data broker and like private sector use. And this is something that like Congress has a couple bills that have been introduced, like the Fourth Amendment is not for sale, and things like that. And that doesn't really seem like it has a clear trend upward yet, or like I can't tell if that's working. And facial recognition technology laws keep getting passed, but still like only like 20 cities or something, which is not the world. That's not like going to address sort of the scale of like how it's used. So I think it's gaining momentum, and I hope groups like, here we go, groups like Shy Hack Night can dig in. Can dig into like what's going on in your city and just like make sure that the legislative body is aware. Because I think there is enough precedent now that legislative bodies are not afraid to address it. But I'm not sure that we know how to address it. But the best thing folks can do is like locally work in their community with their legislative body. But you have some precedent under your wings. It's not like it's not happening at all anymore. There was a lot of action in 2020, 2021.
Yeah, that's actually a great segue to, there's like a few questions that people had around examples, right? Examples of community decision-making or successful activism, pushing back. I think you had mentioned, Rebecca, like the top of your presentation, the pushback for Sidewalk Labs. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the examples of success in pushing back and sort of achieving some of these things in places you've seen so far?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I did a few 360 interviews with anonymous folks who will not be mentioned about some of these like core projects before I started the research. So like for Sidewalk, I talked to like an advocate, someone that worked at Sidewalk, and government official. And I did the same for like Link NYC and like a few other things. The mobility data specification, which is like the scooter data issue. But when I would talk to folks, it was very, like, I felt like I was getting the whole, it's like the companies changed or pulled out because it was just easier for them than not to, or like with Sidewalk, like the real estate investment didn't work. Like it didn't feel like a full, like, oh, there's so much pushback. We just have to stop. It was like always a combination of variables, but the pushback was one variable. But Sidewalk in particular, they were very like consistent, and also like a very encouraging thing they did there was just sort of hold space. It's like a very catchy phrase right now, but hold space for community members to just say like, maybe I don't want this. Is this good? Like they had a lot of events, or like the Some Thoughts newsletter thing where they had like a bunch of thinkers talk about like why Sidewalk Labs might be good or bad. But they basically, they created all these public comment vehicles that the city didn't appropriately do before they started sending out the RFP. So they like reverse engineered, like, oh, you didn't ask for public comment, so I'm just going to create like these public comment vehicles. And I think similarly to like Link NYC, like they still exist, but like the privacy policy is different. Like there's a great like track changes the EFF still has on their website about like the privacy policy. Like before, there were a bunch of articles and like people saying they were uncomfortable versus after. But then also there's still cameras in the Link NYC kiosk. I think it's like a real mixed bag, but always doing something is better than nothing. And I think really sort of just showing government what democracy looks like is like really powerful. Like that's why I really like the Sidewalk examples, like not just like do the democratic things, have dialogue, have multiple people, protests, talk about like pros and cons, and try to be really connected to your representatives.
Collective action.
Okay,
cool. I think we got time maybe for one more. You want to take the last one, Eric? There's many questions that we're sorting through, and we're trying to combine.
Yeah.
You can also email me if you want to, people. I answer emails.
So we have a question. Again, I'm kind of trying to combine a couple questions here, but we've talked about different examples, different strategies. Have you seen like any cities that have been setting up like specific like data advisory boards or councils, and whether or not, you know, whether that's like a mix of legislative people or, you know, perhaps others like interested community members or people with expertise or things like that?
Yeah, I have a bunch of examples in the report. A lot of them are tied to another piece of like legislation. So like some of the cities that have surveillance technology oversight laws have these advisory bodies. I believe Oakland does. I don't know if I can remember them all off the top of my head. There aren't that many, but they're cited in the report for sure. I think it's sort of like a mixed review on Are those the right folks, and are they really making the decision, or are they just sort of like, or are they making like really like meaningful advice on like what the city ends up doing? I think for many like police tech, but like many tech oversight laws right now, it like there is, I think, warranted critique that you're just sort of making it like a more lengthy process, and you're basically doing it anyway, not very differently than you would have done, and you just bogged it down by like 2 years. And also like it doesn't seem like the answers often like just don't do it at all. So like I think looking at those advisory bodies with a critical eye is important. I also, the surveillance technology laws were pretty closely aligned with like smart city technology surveillance concerns. So I did like a blog post for Harvard on all of those laws. And I did a couple like tables. So you can see which ones have advisory bodies and which ones have rights to action and which ones have different sort of democratic, and it's not all of them, right? It's like four of the surveillance tech, of the 13 surveillance technology laws have these sorts of things, or like suppression if there is collection, which also seems like a valuable protection to that first person's question about what's used in court.
Cool. Well, I think, yeah, we're just at time. So thank you again for the presentation, Rebecca.
I hope it spurred thinking, and check out the report for more citations, and email me if you have any questions. It's very possible the questions have no answers, but
but you're asking them.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think we'll switch over to the more interactive portion of the evening. So for folks who want to stick around, we'll be starting a Zoom call in a moment here. We'll drop a link to that in the live chat and on Slack, and you're welcome to meet us over there. Rebecca, will you be able to join us for a few minutes on that?
I'll join for 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay, all right. So I think we'll better make every minute count then. So I think we can wrap things here. And you wanna say our catchphrase, Eric?
Yeah, it's time to go forth and hack. Maybe in the rain. We'll see.
All right. All right. Thanks, folks.